Before tragedy struck, altering everything, John Valentino was a determined businessman known for his keen intellect and commanding presence in the world of finance. He built his career by navigating currency markets for elite clients, including prominent hedge funds. His success brought him wealth and power, but it also created enemies, setting the stage for a betrayal that would shatter his life. John believed he had complete control over both his professional and personal life. On the surface, his marriage to Eleanor appeared perfect, yet beneath the facade of success, a deep betrayal was brewing, waiting to destroy him. What happened next wasn't a simple robbery, it was a meticulously planned conspiracy by those he trusted. One August morning, John's life took a horrifying turn. After an ordinary start to the day, he stepped into his building's elevator, joined by two strangers. Their casual conversation quickly turned menacing, and before John could react, he was attacked. His last thought before losing consciousness was the grim realization that he had been betrayed. But it was too late. "Mr. Doe," a voice called, louder now as he felt a sharp pain in his hand, his index finger being crushed. Good, he thought, but he couldn't breathe, feeling an overwhelming heaviness. "You're in the hospital," John, the voice was clearer. "I need to run a few tests. Then you can sleep, hospital?" Sleep, he struggled to open his eyes but managed to glimpse a light. "Good. Try again," the voice urged as a blinding light stabbed at his senses before disappearing. "Can you squeeze my hand?" He felt pressure and attempted to move. "Great, now wiggle your toes." A sharp scrape on his foot made him flinch. "Excellent. You're improving, Mr. Doe." Rest again. Darkness enveloped him. When he regained consciousness, it felt as if he was rising from a heavy weight, struggling to break free. He sensed cool air from a fan, his legs moving as if he were walking in bed, though he wasn't. A faint beep echoed behind him, followed by brief buzzing on his right, and then a persistent chime. He tried to turn his head, setting off an alarm near his feet. "What's happening?" he wondered, disoriented. "Hey there, mate," a friendly voice said. He heard a chair scrape and felt a hand on his shoulder. "You're waking up after being in a coma for a long time." Something tugged on his arm, silencing the beeping. "I'm Brian, one of the nurses taking care of you." John tried to speak, but nothing came out. "You can't talk yet because there's a tracheostomy tube in your neck to help you breathe. You're on a ventilator, but we're hoping to remove it soon." He felt a damp cloth wipe his right eye and cheek. "What's wrong with my face?" he wondered, unable to feel the left side. "Try to open your eye, John." "I'll dim the lights," Brian said. "Okay, give it a try." John blinked, seeing a blurry light. The cloth wiped his eye again, and things brightened. "We're clearing ointment from your eye after the drops," Brian explained, wiping again. The room slowly came into focus, and a figure loomed over him. "Blink a few times, it'll help," Brian said, becoming clearer to John. Long brown hair, a short beard, and a stethoscope over dark blue scrubs. "Welcome back, buddy." "It's been a long journey," Brian said with a grin, holding a red flashlight. "I'm going to check your eye." "Okay." The light was bright but bearable. "Great, now for the next part. Squeeze my fingers." John squeezed. "Good, now wiggle your toes." John complied. "All right," Brian said, tapping a tablet. "We're calling you JN because we don't know your real name, but you've responded to it." "Is your name John?" "Nod or shake your head." John nodded. "Yes. 2 points for the red team." Brian laughed, updating his tablet. "You're in the ICU at St. Joe's. You've been here for over a month. It's Wednesday, September 29th, 2021. John struggled to process this through his foggy mind. "If you look by the door, you'll see a whiteboard with the date and the names of your doctor and the staff working with you." Brian explained, pointing. "I'm Brian and Dr. Bellin is the intensivist. Ma is your medical assistant and RT is your respiratory therapist." Brian walked back to the bed. "It's 2 a.m. and we're in the middle of the night shift." He held up a clear plastic tube. "This is a suction catheter. I'm going to clear the saliva from the back of your mouth." John heard a slurping sound, but barely felt anything. "Other things you should know," Brian continued. "You have a tracheostomy tube, an NG tube in your stomach, and a catheter in your bladder, so you might feel like you have to pee." John did, indeed, feel that way. "Don't worry, your urine's going into a bag by your bed," Brian reassured him. "We've tied your wrists with soft restraints to prevent you from pulling anything out while you're still medicated. Once you're off the ventilator, we can remove them if you promise not to tug at anything." Brian's voice softened. "Are you in pain?" "Squeeze my hand if you are." John shrugged, unsure. Okay, we want to keep you comfortable, but not too out of it, Brian explained, gesturing toward a row of medical instruments. You're on a lot of medication right now, but we'll reduce it when we can. None of it made sense to John, so he stared at the ceiling and drifted off, his sleep filled with terrifying dreams of pain and fear, images that faded quickly. John woke, gasping for air, alarms blaring on his left. His left side was still bandaged, and he coughed, feeling sharp pain in his throat and chest. "Easy does it," a gentle female voice said. A blonde woman appeared. "I'm Sarah, your respiratory therapist. We're gradually taking you off the ventilator." "Are you in pain?" John nodded, the intense pain in his face becoming clear. His legs moved slightly, guided by robotic attachments, making him walk in place while lying down. "I'll get your nurse," Sarah said, then disappeared. Later, John woke more alert. The ventilator was replaced by a misting blue hose, and he sat higher in bed. His legs were free from the robotic devices, and his mind felt clearer. It was a busy morning with doctors, nurses, and therapists coming and going. He was moved to another area of the hospital for scans. The nurses praised his progress, though John couldn't grasp much of the medical terminology. They helped him sit in a chair and stand briefly. The doctors reassured him that his brain was functioning despite the traumatic brain injury (TBI) he had sustained. One doctor mentioned that his shattered skull had prevented his brain from herniating due to the swelling. The highlight of John's day came when they removed the catheter, allowing him to urinate on his own. Simple pleasures. A few days later, John awoke to find several unfamiliar people in dark suits gathered around his bed, giving him an unsettling feeling. Mr. Doe said, the tallest of the group, a man with wild red hair and a grey goatee, his dark eyes serious. "I'm Dr. Everett J. Malcolm," he introduced himself without extending a hand. John, still fitted with a smaller tracheostomy tube that allowed him to speak with the right valve, nodded nervously, remaining silent for now, as the valve wasn't currently attached. "I represent a medical research consortium," Dr. Malcolm began, his tone dismissive. "We specialize in advanced medical and biochemical breakthroughs," he added with a slight shrug and a frown. "We've been monitoring your progress for the past 7 weeks and contributing to it. We're here to discuss your rehabilitation and potential options you may want to consider." John, his hand trembling, reached for his dry erase board and scribbled, "What is this about?" Dr. Malcolm read the words and responded, "It's best we first discuss your current condition and how you got here before we move on to options." He gestured to a woman in a white lab coat with short hair and a stern look, who stepped forward holding a tablet. "Mr. Doe," she began, "you've been in the hospital for almost 2 months." She paused as John tried to write again. "We don't know exactly how you were injured. Bystanders thought you were dead after you suffered a severe beating," she explained, showing John grim photos from the ER. John turned his head, trying to see the images clearly. "An ambulance took you to the nearest emergency room for what was assumed to be a death declaration," she continued, "but you were barely alive. This happened on August 14th. John blinked, trying to process the information. "You had no identification, and your fingerprints matched no records, no scars, tattoos, or surgeries to identify you. Facial recognition didn't help either." John began writing again, but she interrupted. "It doesn't matter who you are, Mr. Doe. As far as anyone knows, you're deceased." She showed him a death certificate. "You technically died 3 times in the first week," she added, pausing before continuing. "And you've accumulated an enormous medical bill," she said, turning the tablet to reveal the amount over $1 million. "That doesn't even include our life-saving efforts," Dr. Malcolm noted. "You haven't started rehabilitation yet, and you're already buried in debt." John thought, what comforting bedside manner. Dr. Malcolm continued, "Your situation opens unique possibilities that we believe you should consider before deciding your next steps." Another man, of East Asian descent, approached John's bed and bowed slightly. "Mr. Doe," he began, "to be blunt, you have a long road ahead before you can hope to return to a normal life." He paused, listing John's injuries. "You're still dealing with a serious head injury, more fractures than I can count, significant spinal cord damage causing partial paralysis on your left side, and you've lost your left eye along with a large portion of the surrounding bone and tissue. In addition, your reproductive organs have suffered severe trauma, and it's unclear if your right testicle is still functional." John was overwhelmed by the news, struggling to grasp the extent of his injuries. as no one had explained everything to him until now. He grimaced, trying to recall something concrete, but only vague, nightmarish images came to mind. Dr. Malcolm cleared his throat, drawing John's focus back. In a way, Dr. Malcolm said, almost nonchalantly, "You can thank our early interventions for still being alive." He pulled off his gold-rimmed glasses, fobbed them with his breath, and wiped them with a silk cloth. "Now, let's discuss your two options moving forward," he said, putting his glasses back on. "One option is to continue with your current care plan, which involves transferring you to a rehabilitation facility that focuses on helping patients regain strength, mobility, and independence," he explained. "However, without insurance or significant payment information, the quality of care you'll receive will be far from ideal." John felt his anxiety rising, the urge to escape growing stronger as the cold, businesslike suit stared down at him. Dr. Malcolm's voice sliced through the tension. "There is another option," he said, stepping aside as a younger, anxious-looking man with a tablet approached John's bed. "Mr. Du," the young man stammered before we proceed, "we need your signature on a few forms." He handed John the tablet, and John's eyes scanned the dense legal text. "You can read it all if you want," the young man joked nervously, "but we'd all be old and grey by the time you finished." Realizing his joke fell flat, he cleared his throat. "Your first signature gives us permission to treat you, access to your medical records, and the authority to make legal and medical decisions on your behalf for the immediate future." John hesitated, then pressed the yellow signature button and scribbled his name with his finger. "Great," the young man said, visibly relieved, flipping to another page. "But these next signatures are important. By agreeing to our treatment, you accept the risks and agree not to hold us liable for any complications or negative outcomes," he said with a wink. "But don't worry, Mr. Doe, you'll be in better hands than at a basic rehab facility." He swiped to the last screen. "Lastly, this is our non-disclosure agreement. By signing, you agree not to discuss any aspect of your care from this point forward." John stared at the screen, then set the tablet down. He picked up his dry erase board and slowly wrote, "What do I get in return?" Dr. Malcolm nodded approvingly. "A fair question, Mr. Doe," Dr. Malcolm said. "While I can't guarantee you'll fully recover, I can assure you that with our advanced technology, you might even exceed your previous physical limits," he added, crossing his arms with a smile. "Of course, there are no guarantees," he cautioned. John glanced back at the tablet, still uncertain. Another man in the group cleared his throat softly, earning a frown from Dr. Malcolm. "If I may," the man said quietly, turning to John. "Mr. Doe, I should also mention that by volunteering for our experimental program, all your financial debts will be forgiven, regardless of the outcome." John looked back at Dr. Malcolm, who gave a subtle nod. Taking a deep breath, John picked up the tablet and scribbled his signature again before handing it back. "Excellent, Mr. Doe," Dr. Malcolm said, a gleam in his eye. "Your new program will begin shortly. You'll be transferred to our facility by tonight." The group of strangers left as quietly as they had entered, and John lay back, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. By the time John arrived at the new facility, everything felt like a blur. A petite doctor named Janice Willoughby, with shoulder-length brown hair and large glasses, introduced herself. "When you first came to our attention," she said clinically, "your chances of survival were less than 5%. Standing about 5'8" with a thin frame hidden beneath scrubs and an oversized lab coat, her voice was steady and methodical, like she was reading from a textbook. "We've been following your progress and have played a key role in your recovery," she continued. "Your brain was so swollen from the trauma that, had your skull not been opened, you would have died. Fortunately, the brain could expand beyond the skull, which is what saved your life." She pointed to MRI, CT, and PT scans on a nearby screen. The images meant nothing to John, but Dr. Willoughby kept going. "Your injuries were severe: a Lefort-3 fracture to your facial bones, traumatic damage to your left eye socket, causing permanent optic nerve damage, meaning that eye is lost. You also had right testicular torsion, resulting in the loss of that organ. You suffered multiple lung contusions, and you broke bones in your legs, arms, ribs, and left collarbone." John winced internally as she listed the extent of the damage. "We've repaired or reconstructed most of your facial bones," she continued, "but the swelling and scarring are still there." She held up a small silver bag and explained, "To manage the swelling and pressure, we administered mannitol to draw fluid from your brain. However, in your case, its effectiveness was limited due to the damage in other areas." She raised the bag. This, along with several other treatments, saved your life. John stared at the bag, his thoughts foggy and his body still aching. Dr. Willoughby's voice went on, mentioning the advanced technologies used in his recovery. We've also used a synthetic blood plasma replacement, she said, which contains millions of nanobots that respond to telemetry. They help regulate your blood flow, prevent clotting, and repair damaged tissues. These nanobots will stay in your body for the rest of your life. John barely understood what she was explaining. It all felt surreal, like he was part of a bizarre sci-fi experiment. She paused, her intense gaze fixed on him. Tomorrow we'll start the next phase of your treatment. We'll be correcting your spinal vertebrae and addressing the nerve pathways causing paralysis on your left side. John cleared his throat, testing his voice for the first time. How long will that take, he asked. It's a routine procedure, she replied matter-of-factly. You should be back in your room by noon, and we'll have a clear idea of your left side deficits shortly after. Sounds great, Doc John muttered with a weak smirk. 2 months earlier, on Saturday, August 14th, just after 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, John Valentino hurried home. He stepped off the bus and rushed the half-block to his apartment building, a 50-story high-rise. The doorman nodded at him as he passed by. Dealing with Nicky, John grumbled, annoyed at having wasted so many hours just to keep up with the markets. He reached the elevator and pressed the button for the 36th floor. 2 other men joined him as he waited. The door opened and they all stepped inside. John hit the button for his floor, while one of the men pressed the button for the 40th floor. John frowned, recognizing that floors belonging to a hedge fund he had worked with before. "You're Mr. Valentino?" Wright asked, a voice with a thick Jersey accent from behind him. "Yeah, who's asking?" John replied, not bothering to turn around. "Our buddy Lenny told us about you, said you're a real shark in the markets." Lenny, who John asked, frowning as he began to turn around. A loud clicking sound filled the elevator and his head exploded with blinding pain and white light. "Johnny," a voice called mockingly. "Hey, Johnny!" John was jerked back into consciousness by the sharp sting of ammonia under his nose. His head pounded and his eyes teared up. He groaned and tried to move but couldn't. "There he is," said the same mocking voice. John's vision cleared, and he found himself staring up at a middle-aged man with a sharp, hawk-like face. The man, wearing a 3-piece Italian suit, had slick-back black hair and reeked of cheap cologne. He grinned down at John while holding the smelling salts at arm's length. "What's going on?" John rasped, his throat dry. "Hey, Johnny, welcome back," the man replied. "Who are you?" John asked, noticing more details about his situation. His hands were tied behind his back, his feet bound, and he was lying naked on a cold, hard linoleum floor. "What's this?" John struggled but couldn't move. The man straightened up, tossing the smelling salts aside, his smile never fading. "I'm Leonard Russo." "My friends call me Lenny," he said, gesturing around. "And this," he added with a smirk, "is the first day of the rest of your life, however long that may be." John's head throbbed as he tried to understand what was happening. "Why are you doing this to me? Get him up, boys," Lenny ordered. The 2 men from the elevator grabbed John by the arms and pulled him to his feet. He swayed but remained held upright. He glanced around, trying to recognize where he was, but nothing seemed familiar. His eyes returned to Lenny, filled with fear. "You see, Johnny, it's like this," Lenny began, pacing in front of him. "You've been working hard, manipulating the currency markets for a friend of mine," he said, stopping right in John's face with a grin. "And you've done a fantastic job." Lenny waved a device resembling a cattle prod in front of John's face. "But I also know you've been skimming off some of this friend's money into a nice, hidden offshore account, supposedly to keep it safe from prying eyes." Cold sweat broke out across John's body. No one knew about the secret transfers except for him and Andrea, his boss. "That's not true," John started to protest, but Lenny moved swiftly, activating the taser and jabbing it into John's chest. A scream tore from John's throat as 50,000 volts of electricity shot through his body, sending every muscle into violent spasms. The pain was unbearable, and John blacked out for a moment. "Don't take me for a fool, Mr. Valentino," Lenny yelled, grabbing John's face and forcing him to make eye contact. "My patience is wearing thin. I want those account numbers and access codes to the offshore accounts, and I want them now. It's only going to get worse the longer you hold out." "Please," John gasped, regaining his voice. "You don't understand, no. Wait, he cried as Lenny raised the taser again. Lenny shook his head, sneering. Johnny, 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 he muttered, wagging a finger in John's face. Ellie was right about you. You know. John's heart sank instantly. Eleanor, they must have gotten to her first, tortured her. His wife, just days away from their first anniversary, had been waiting for him to come home so they could celebrate. They must have grabbed her right after he left the office. He had just spoken to her as he was leaving. Eleanor. John struggled with renewed strength as the two thugs held him tight. What have you done to her? He demanded. Lenny burst into laughter, as if he had just heard the funniest joke. What have I done? John yelled, overwhelmed with anger and disbelief. Man, you're a real idiot. More laughter echoed from behind him as John tiredly turned his head from side to side. Hey, Ellie, baby, come over here and tell this fool what I've been doing to you, Lenny called out. John turned his head toward the sound of high heels clicking against the floor. Hello, Johnny, she said smoothly, her voice confident and rich as she moved beside Lenny, pressing herself against him. Shock, confusion and heartbreak swirled in John's mind as he stared at her, eyes wide in disbelief. There was no emotion in her cornflower blue eyes as she looked at him. Eleanor de Mercurio Valentino, standing at 5A, was as elegant as ever, with her bronze hair cut to shoulder length, shining in the light. She wore a fashionable seafoam green evening gown with 4-inch white leather stilettos. She looked like she had just stepped off the cover of a magazine. Ellie, what? John stammered. Oh, Johnny, Lenny laughed. For someone as smart as you, you're such a fool. He grinned at the men holding John. You really have no idea, do you? The laughter around them grew louder. This woman you married, Lenny said, wrapping an arm around her waist. She's mine. The two kissed passionately in front of John, their lips locking, tongues entwining. Disbelief and fury surged inside John as his legs buckled, but the men holding him kept him steady. How could this be happening? I bet you didn't know I was screwing her right before she walked down the aisle to marry you, Lenny laughed again. Ellie and I have been together since she was sneaking out of her mom's house. John lowered his head in defeat, staring at the floor miserably. He shut his eyes tight, trying to stop the tears of frustration from falling. Oh, do you make him cry? Eleanor teased in a mocking tone. She giggled as John took ragged breaths, trying to make sense of the ultimate betrayal. How did I not see this? When he opened his eyes again, she was standing right in front of him, her once beautiful face twisted in a cruel sneer. This wasn't the Eleanor he had fallen in love with and married. This version of her was darker, more confident, and completely devoid of love or compassion. Tell him what he wants to know, Johnny, she said coldly, lifting his chin with a perfectly manicured fingernail. It'll be easier for you if you do. Her voice suddenly softened, becoming the sweet tone of the woman he used to love. You always said you'd do anything for me, right, baby? Don't you want me to be happy, sweetheart? She cooed seductively. Anger flared inside John as he glared at her, surprising her for just a moment before her cold demeanor returned. She released his chin and reached down, grabbing him by the groin. Her nails dug into his skin, and John screamed as the pain intensified. Give us the account numbers and codes, she screamed in his face. Whoa, easy there, babe, Lenny chuckled, pulling her away. We're saving the jewels for last. He turned to her as he began unfastening his trousers. You want to hurt his manhood? Let's show him what you've got. A wicked gleam appeared in Eleanor's eyes as she looked back at John with a smirk, then knelt in front of Lenny, humiliating John further. See this, baby, she taunted John. This is what a real man is. John tried to look away, but one of the men holding him forced his head to watch. Nausea rolled through him as he was made to witness the degrading scene. Lenny took her right there in front of him, and tears streamed down John's face as the last fragments of love he had for her burned away in a blaze of rage. The betrayal was unbearable, but watching her enjoy it made it far worse. When Lenny was done, he grinned at John. You like that? Now let's get back to business. John felt all hope slipping away. His body was broken, his spirit shattered. The pain barely registered anymore as he tried to retreat into his mind. But Lenny wasn't finished. He clicked the taser back on. One more chance, Johnny, Lenny said coldly. Give me the codes, or you won't last much longer. John, exhausted and devastated, choked out, Please just let her go. Don't hurt her. Lenny sneered. "Oh, Johnny, you still don't get it, do you?" He gestured toward Eleanor. "She's been in on this from the beginning. She's not the one suffering here, you are." John looked at her, his heart sinking even lower. She stood there, calm, without a trace of the woman he once adored. "Tell him," Lenny ordered. Eleanor smiled coldly. "It's true, Johnny. I never loved you. This was always about the money. Just give him what he wants, and make it easier on yourself." John's last shred of hope crumbled. He was utterly alone, and everything he believed in had been a lie. Lenny leaned in close, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "So what's it going to be, Valentino?" Unable to take any more, John finally broke. "Fine," he gasped. "I'll give you the codes. Just stop." Lenny's wolfish grin returned. Good boy, they dragged John back into a chair, and Eleanor sat at the laptop, ready to enter the codes. Through clenched teeth, John began reciting the numbers and passwords, each word draining the last bit of his will. When the codes were entered, Lenny checked the screen, his face lighting up with satisfaction. "See, that wasn't so hard, was it?" Lenny mocked. John slumped in the chair, barely conscious, his body racked with pain from the unending torment. His vision blurred, and his mind spiraled into a fog of betrayal and agony. "Well, Johnny." "Thanks for cooperating," Lenny said mockingly, nodding to his thugs. "Sam, Paulie, finish him." John closed his eyes, welcoming the darkness. He didn't care anymore. Everything he loved was gone. Suddenly a boot slammed into his ribs, sending a fresh wave of pain through him. But this time it felt different. With grim satisfaction, John realized he had survived just long enough to give them the codes. Yet deep inside, an ember of rage still smoldered. In a final act of defiance, John lifted his bound hands and struck Lenny in the groin with all the strength he had left. Lenny screamed, stumbling back in pain. "I won't let you win," John muttered, the last ounce of rebellion fueling his broken body. "You son of a," Lenny roared, clutching himself. John didn't see the boot that slammed into his face, plunging him into darkness for the final time. As he slipped into oblivion, John felt a grim satisfaction, hearing Lenny's furious shout, "He bit me. God damn it, he bit me." A boot came crashing down on John's head, and then there was only silence. By Friday, October 15th, Monique Tibido had entered John's life. A striking woman of mixed heritage, she had inherited the best traits from her French mother and African-American father. Her sharp facial features, high cheekbones, and deep grey eyes gave her a captivating appearance. Her hair, bleached a light copper color, was styled straight and fell to her shoulders, with step bangs framing her thin brows and piercing gaze. Normally, Monique wore tight leggings and halter tops, but during John's pool therapy sessions, she opted for a revealing one-piece swimsuit. John had met Monique shortly after his spinal surgery, and they had spent countless hours together since then. When she wasn't helping him with resistance exercises or guiding him through walking practice, she assisted with daily tasks like dressing, eating, cooking, and even shaving. As his massage therapist, she also helped him regain control over routine functions like typing, texting, and using the remote. John had developed a mixture of admiration and frustration toward Monique. No matter how angry or harsh he became, Monique always remained upbeat and positive. Despite his irritation, he couldn't deny her success. He was growing stronger and regaining independence. He eventually learned that nanobots played a significant role in his recovery, helping his muscles heal faster and become leaner. One Saturday evening, Monique entered his room wearing a terracloth robe and carrying a tray. She noticed his tired expression and laughed softly. "Don't look too thrilled to see me, John," she teased, sitting on the edge of his queen-sized bed. As she did, the robe parted at her knees, revealing a portion of her long, mahogany-toned leg. "You can relax. I'm not here in any official capacity." "Well, not exactly," she added with a playful grin. John grumbled. "I thought we were done for the day," but despite his soreness and fatigue, he didn't really mind her presence. In fact, he found himself more drawn to her with each passing day, even though all he wanted at the moment was a good night's sleep. "I spoke with Dr. Willoughby earlier," Monique said, setting the tray down on the bed. She mentioned needing a seed sample. To be exact, John's eyes widened in surprise. Monique smiled slyly. "She wanted you to take care of it tomorrow morning, but I convinced her we could get it sooner." She lifted a small packet from the tray. John was speechless as Monique stood and slowly untied her robe, letting it fall open. His eyes followed her every movement, taking in her flawless body. She sat back on the bed and gently cradled his scarred face in her soft hands before kissing him. John's mind raced. He had admired her beauty for a while, but he never imagined this. Her touch was tender yet intense, stirring something deep within him. For the first time since his injury, John felt desire. Monique expertly collected the sample with clinical precision, though there was a closeness to her actions that went beyond the technical task. When she finished, she stood up, gathered the tray, and began walking toward the door. John's gaze stayed on her, captivated by her graceful movements. Just as she reached the door, it unexpectedly opened, and Dr. Willoughby walked in, her expression neutral. She took the tray from Monique without saying a word and left. Monique turned back to John with a smile, walked back to the bed, and crawled under the covers beside him, her robe still open. John welcomed her embrace, wrapping his arms around her as they kissed again, this time with deeper passion. When they finally pulled apart, Monique gazed lovingly into his eyes. "Now we're free to make all the love we want," she whispered, her words like music to John's ears. After everything he had been through, John never thought he would feel warmth or connection again, but Monique was bringing him back to life. Their relationship grew stronger, blending physical rehabilitation with emotional support. Monique was by his side through the darkest moments of his recovery. At the same time, John underwent intense psychological counseling, trying to piece together his fragmented memories and cope with the trauma. As more memories of the violence he had suffered resurfaced, he began to experience nightmares. No amount of physical therapy or nanobot technology could ease the weight of his emotional torment, but waking up in Monique's arms each morning brought him a small sense of peace. As John's physical recovery progressed, other staff members at the Institute began taking notice, eager to test his body's limits. He underwent a series of challenges, from strength tests to endurance trials. At one point, they even subjected him to extreme solar radiation in a high-tech tanning booth, observing as his skin absorbed the rays without burning, though he did end up with an impressive tan. While he wasn't quite an Olympic athlete yet, his potential was undeniable. However, one issue continued to trouble the doctors: his left eye, or rather its absence. Throughout his rehabilitation, John wore an eye patch over a soft orbital prosthetic. He had undergone several delicate surgeries to reconstruct his optic nerves and orbital structure. Finally, the day arrived when he was ready for his mechanical eye. Sitting in a room full of doctors, John listened as they explained the benefits and drawbacks of the device. One of the doctors handed him a model and described how it would connect to his remaining nerve fibers. "This is all cutting-edge technology and highly experimental," the doctor explained. "So I'm a guinea pig," John joked, trying to lighten the mood. "In a way, yes," the doctor replied, "but on the bright side, what do you have to lose?" John chuckled. "So with this new eye, I won't be blind anymore, but I won't exactly see either." "We can't say for certain until after the procedure," the doctor responded, "but we're expecting improved night vision. However, you won't have color vision or depth perception from the prosthetic." John raised his hands in surrender, stopping the technical talk. "Let's just do it and see how it goes. Where do I sign?" The surgery was performed the next day, and John's eye was bandaged as his tissues healed. The nanobots were expected to assist in the process, and everyone anxiously awaited the results. During his recovery, Dr. Malcolm made brief visits, emotionally distant, but always praising John's progress. The Institute had also given John access to information about his past life and the financial dealings that had led to his brutal attack. He spent hours on the computer, conducting his own investigation, tracking the funds from the corrupted accounts, and carefully piecing together every digital move his enemies had made. Despite the legal team's advice to let go of the past, John was determined. He would have his revenge on those responsible for his suffering. When John re-entered society, his facial scars made him unrecognizable to anyone from his previous life. People avoided him, and though the doctors offered plastic surgery, he refused. The scars were a constant reminder of his hatred for his ex-wife, Eleanor, and her lover, Lenny. John wasn't done with them, far from it. On Friday, December 17, 2021, Jimmy Sims, known as Sweet Jimmy, sat at his vanity, putting the finishing touches on his makeup. Humming Aretha Franklin's Respect, he puckered his lips at the fabulous reflection in the mirror. Wearing a curly wig and glamorous lashes, he twirled before the mirror and reached for his sequined gown. A knock at the dressing room door interrupted his routine. "Sweet Jimmy isn't ready for visitors," he called out in a sweet voice. The door was locked, but it snapped open as a tall figure stepped in, dressed in blue jeans and a hoodie, the hood pulled low to obscure his face. "I won't take much of your time," a deep voice rumbled. Jimmy paled, a chill running down his spine. "Who are you?" "Relax, buddy," the figure said. "I'm not here to hurt you." Jimmy cautiously turned back to the mirror, eyeing the man behind him. "Zip me up, sugar," he asked, trying to regain his usual flair. John snorted and stepped forward to zip up Jimmy's gown. "Sweet Jimmy always has time for his biggest fans," Jimmy purred, "and you're definitely one of my biggest." John stayed silent, but the tension in the room was palpable. "I've got something else in mind," John said in a low voice. "A favor." "Oh, sweet Jimmy loves doing favors," Jimmy purred, slipping into his platform stilettos and strapping them on. "Come to the club on Friday night, and I'll make sure you get what you need." Sweet Jimmy blew a kiss at the mirror before fixing a smudge in his mascara. "But why don't you tell me what you're really after, honey?" He glanced at the man's reflection in the mirror. John pulled back his hood, revealing his scarred face. Jimmy's eyes widened as he turned to face John, reaching out to touch the lifeless glass eye staring back at him. "Oh baby," Jimmy cried, "who did this to you?" John allowed the touch for a moment before stepping back. "Let's just say I've got a score to settle with Sam and Paulie." Jimmy gasped at the mention of their names, knowing exactly who they were. He shook his head in fear. "Oh no, sweet Jimmy had his run-ins with those two. No way am I getting involved again. They love to hurt people." "I know," Jimmy John said calmly. "All I need you to do is get them outside. Promise them anything, and I swear they'll never hurt you or anyone else again." John pulled a wad of cash from his pocket and tossed it onto the vanity. "For your trouble." The parking lot behind the Bearded Clam was dim and unpaved, surrounded by cars, trucks and motorcycles, with only the faint light from the street lamps at the front and sides of the building offering any illumination. The back door swung open, letting the heavy bass of the club's music seep into the quiet night. Jimmy stumbled out, clearly drunk, followed by two mob enforcers who were eager to spend time with Sweet Jimmy. "Oh, Sweet Jimmy's on fire tonight," they shouted as Jimmy danced away from them, pulling out a pack of cigarettes. Holding one up seductively, he smiled. "Do either of you boys have a light?" he purred. S and Paulie followed him to the center of the lot, growing irritated as Jimmy shrugged and lit the cigarette himself. The flicker of the lighter momentarily blinded them as they mumbled about having their fun and going back inside. "Well, well, well," an ominous voice called from the shadows. "If it isn't Paulie and S. How's it going?" Boys startled. They spun around to see a dark figure stepping out from the shadows. "Who the hell are you sneaking up on us like that?" Paulie barked angrily, balling his fists as he prepared to strike the intruder. "Don't you remember me?" Paulie John said as he moved forward, pulling back his hood. Though the dim light didn't reveal much of his battered face, the glint from his robotic eye was enough to unsettle the mobsters. S tried to move into a flanking position, but John's reflexes were too fast. He grabbed S by the throat, yanking him forward while simultaneously catching Paulie's neck. The two men's heads collided with a sickening thud, and they collapsed at John's feet. Sweet Jimmy's cigarette fell from his lips as he dropped his act. "Holy crap, man. Who the hell are you?" he exclaimed. "Don't worry about it," Jimmy John replied quietly. "Just head back inside and forget this ever happened, okay?" Jimmy, wide-eyed, nodded quickly and rushed back into the bar. Paulie groggily regained consciousness in the early morning, disoriented by the fresh ocean breeze and the cries of seagulls. He found himself seated on a cold wooden beam, his bare feet dangling into the water below. Across from him, S was in the same position, facing him. Paulie winced as he realized barnacles were digging into his back, and he was tied to a piling behind him. His mouth was gagged, and his hands were bound in front of him. He looked down and gasped in horror. His flesh had been nailed to the wooden beam beneath him, with a large spike driven through his most sensitive area. S was in the same agonizing situation. As soon as Paulie fully registered the pain, it surged through him with unbearable intensity. A lazy wave splashed against the pilings, spraying his face and chest. Across from him, S groaned, realizing his predicament and screaming through his gag. "Good morning, boys," John greeted them cheerfully as he waded through the water, which now reached his hips. "I wasn't sure you'd wake up. Thought you might drown before I had the chance," he chuckled. The two men stared at him in horror, unable to recognize the scarred face and mechanical eye looking down at them with amusement. "You don't remember your own handiwork?" John asked, grinning. "Tell me, how's Lenny doing after I tried to bite him off?" He glanced between them, and as realization dawned on their faces, their terror deepened. "Well, I guess you can't tell me much with those gags on," John laughed, holding up an old green wine bottle, crusted with barnacles and clearly plucked from the sea. "Don't you just hate littering? Especially when we could reuse so many things nowadays." He gestured to the barnacle-covered pilings towering above them. "Take this bottle, for instance," he said, swinging it over S's head. S flinched as the bottle shattered against the piling behind him, showering his lap with glass. "Now this bottle can be used to cut," John declared, grabbing a shard of glass. "Let me show you." S whimpered through his gag as John clumsily sawed through the rope tying S to the piling, nicking his skin several times. The rope eventually fell away. "Careful now," John warned. "Don't fall off the beam and end up hanging by that nail." S's eyes went wide as another wave surged higher, and he clung to the beam in fear. John turned to Paulie and began cutting his rope, muttering, "Damn, the tide's coming in faster than I thought." He sliced through Paulie's rope, letting it drop loose. Now only a thin cord kept their hands tied together, leaving them vulnerable as the water rose around them. John stepped back, pointing the broken bottle at their bound limbs. "You've got a choice," he said, his voice firm as they stared at him in terror. "Cut yourselves free, or drown." He nodded toward their wrists. "I've bled a lot lately and learned some things," he added with a sly grin, as though sharing a secret. "It's easy to bleed out, so be careful." Another wave crashed in, almost knocking them off the beam. "That string around your wrists makes a perfect tourniquet," he continued. "You know what a tourniquet is, right?" They stared back, horrified. "It's French for to twist." "Don't ask me why," he shrugged. "Anyway, tie it tight below where you're cutting so you don't bleed out when you free yourselves." His grin darkened. "See? No exsanguination." Another wave hit, threatening to knock them off the beam. "Exsanguination," he repeated slowly. "Cool word, huh? Not French, though. It's Latin. Means bloodless." The water continued rising, and John glanced at the tide. "In a few minutes it'll be over your heads, so you better get moving." He eyed the broken bottle in his hand. "Sorry, I only found one, so you'll have to share." A large wave crashed in, nearly knocking them into the water, but John steadied them for a moment. They looked at him with gratitude. "I could leave the bottle here," he mused, "but it might wash away." He paused, considering. "How about this? I'll give it to the first one who tells me where Lenny and Eleanor are." The men exchanged panicked glances. "Don't take too long," John warned. "Time's running out." That evening, a sleek black Lincoln Continental cruised through the city streets and into a parking garage, descending to the executive level. It stopped by the elevators, and the driver opened the door for Lenny, who helped Eleanor out. Arm in arm, they entered the elevator, with Lenny pressing the button for his penthouse. Unexpectedly, the elevator stopped on the 5th floor, and a large man in a hoodie and sunglasses stepped inside. Lenny glared at him. "This is a private elevator," he snapped. "Use the public one." The man silently held up a black access card, slid it into the VIP slot, and pressed the button for a lower floor. The doors closed again. "You've got a lot of nerve, buddy," Lenny growled, reaching out to grab the man's shoulder. He didn't expect the man to spin around and press the metal prongs of a taser to his throat. Eleanor screamed as the device clicked repeatedly, sending Lenny into violent convulsions before he collapsed to the floor. Frozen in terror, Eleanor watched as the man loomed over her, then pulled back his hood. "Hi, sweetheart," John said cheerfully, removing his sunglasses. "Miss me?" He gave her a few moments to absorb the shock of seeing his scarred face and artificial eye before tasering her as well. As she crumpled next to Lenny, John turned to the elevator's control panel, pulling out a fire access key to reroute the car to the emergency vehicle deployment area on the first basement level. Lenny came to with the sharp sting of repeated slaps. "Hey Lenny, wake up. Time to face the music," John shouted, leaning over his limp body. Lenny groggily shook his head, trying to regain his senses. He soon realized that his hands and feet were tied, and he was lying on the floor of a small, moving compartment. He was also completely naked, shivering from the biting cold. "What the?" he mumbled, looking up, his eyes widening in shock as he recognized the deformed figure looming over him. "Don't you remember me?" John asked with an unsettling cheerfulness. "We were pretty close just a few months ago." A muffled sob came from behind Lenny, and he felt the presence of another body pressed against his back. "Ellie, baby," he muttered. "Oh, isn't love grand?" John sang mockingly as he grabbed Lenny by the chin and propped him up against the bulkhead so he could face his ex-wife, Eleanor. She was also bound, curled up in a fetal position on the cold floor, quietly sobbing at John's feet. "Come on, Ellie," John teased. "Don't be such a killjoy. Tell him." Eleanor looked up at John's mangled face, her eyes red from crying. "Please, John," she whispered, her voice barely audible through her tears. "Johnny," Lenny asked, still in disbelief. "But you're dead. Paulie and S said they fed you to the sharks." John smiled and shook his head. "Oh, Lenny, they messed it up. I fell out of the car onto the street before they could finish the job, so they had to lie to you." He spread his arms in mock exasperation. "Can't get good help these days, right?" The deck beneath them shifted slightly, causing the boat to rock. John turned and climbed up a small ladder, pulling down a duffel bag from above. He rummaged through it and pulled out 2 brick-sized packages wrapped in black plastic. He placed one on either side of the bulkhead above their heads, pressing small buttons on each, causing red lights to blink. "What the hell are you doing?" Lenny demanded, his voice rising in panic. "Well, Lenny, I'm a bit upset," John replied, his tone disturbingly calm, as if they were having a casual conversation. "After everything you did to me, you didn't even have the decency to finish me off." He grinned at Lenny's terrified expression. "Payback's a real pain, isn't it?" John gestured around the small cabin. "We're currently drifting off the Outer Banks on this little cruiser that no one will miss." Reaching back into the duffel bag, John pulled out 2 cinder blocks, placing one next to each of them. He then tied a block to their bound feet with a length of rope. "I've placed shape charges all around the hull," John explained calmly. "Once I set them off, the bottom of this boat will blow out, and you two will go straight down with it." He smiled, clearly enjoying their growing terror. "Did you know great hammerhead sharks migrate through this area?" Lenny and Eleanor both screamed in panic, their desperate pleas echoing off the walls of the small cabin. John ignored their cries as he calmly climbed the ladder to the hatch and exited, leaving them to their fate. Once on deck, he looked around at the dark ocean that stretched endlessly in every direction. Even with his enhanced optical eye, there was nothing but water in sight. He moved to the side of the boat, climbed over, and dropped into a grey Zodiac that was tethered to the yacht. After untying the rope, he yanked the cord on the outboard motor, and it roared to life. Slowly he cruised away from the doomed vessel. Reaching into his pocket, John pulled out a small trigger. Without a moment's hesitation, he flipped the switch. The distant thud of the explosion reverberated through the inflatable boat, vibrating beneath his feet. Had he turned around, John would have seen the yacht shudder briefly before sinking beneath the waves in seconds, leaving no trace behind. It was nearly a 2-hour journey back to shore, and John smiled into the darkness, his thoughts on the future. For the first time in years, he felt lighter, like a heavy weight had been lifted from his soul. Monique had left several magazines lying around, featuring handsome celebrities and models with chiseled cheekbones and dark eyes. According to the experts, John's eye could be modified to match his natural one. He sighed as the cool sea spray splashed his face. He could even tolerate the constant prodding from the Institute staff for a little longer. After all, they had been quite helpful with his little vendetta, and he figured he owed them that much.